The most counterintuitive finding isn't about people who trust their gut blindly. It's about the ones who don't. The careful ones, the analytical ones, the ones who believe, with real conviction, that they think things through. They're the hardest to reach because they've already explained to themselves why their instincts aren't really instincts at all. Picture someone sitting across a table from you. Maybe it's a job interview. Maybe it's a first meeting. Someone your colleague vouches for. Someone you're about to trust with something that matters. The conversation hasn't started yet. There's a glass of water on the table. The chair scrapes as the person settles in. They look at you just for a second, and in that second something already happened. You don't know it happened. You'll swear it didn't. But by the time they open their mouth and say their first sentence, something in you has already decided. Not everything, not permanently, but the direction is set. What follows, the questions you ask, the weight you give their answers, the moments you lean forward versus the moments you lean back, all of it flows downstream from that first current. And that current was already running before either of you said a word. Here's the strange part. This isn't a flaw in the thinking. This is the thinking. The mind doesn't wait for the full picture before it begins building. It starts immediately with whatever is available, and it constructs something coherent enough to operate on. What you see, the posture, the expression, the brief flash of eye contact, the quality of their stillness or their restlessness, that becomes the whole story. Not a sketch, not a rough draft, a story, a finished one. The mind doesn't flag it as incomplete. It doesn't put a question mark next to it and wait for more data to fill in the gaps. It presents the story to you as reality. And then reality is what you act on. There's a name for this mechanism, the tendency to treat the available information as if it were the complete information, as if the slice of evidence in front of you were the entire landscape, as if the frame contained everything outside the frame. But the name doesn't really matter here. What matters is what it costs when you don't see it operating. Because the thing that makes this mechanism so durable, so resistant to correction, is that it feels nothing like a shortcut. It feels like perception. It feels like understanding. It feels sometimes like knowing a person. And by the time you realize the knowing was assembled from fragments, the full picture has already shaped every question you asked, every answer you waited, every instinct you trusted. The story was told before the conversation began, and you were its author without knowing you were writing. The effect doesn't stop at first impressions of a full person. It spreads sideways. Find one thing that you genuinely like about someone, something real, something that lands, and watch what happens to everything else about them. Their ideas suddenly seem sharper. Their pauses seem thoughtful rather than slow. Even their clothing choices start to make sense in a way they didn't a moment ago. This isn't generosity. It isn't the warmth of a good connection. It's a contamination, a quiet automatic spreading of that one positive signal across every dimension you haven't actually examined yet. And it works the other way with the same efficiency. One thing that grates, a nervous laugh, a word they chose wrong, an energy that doesn't quite land. And suddenly you're reading their ideas more critically. Their silences feel evasive. Their confidence reads as arrogance. One signal colonizes the whole field. The mind, building its coherent story, uses the available piece to shade in the parts it hasn't seen. It doesn't flag those shaded parts as uncertain. It presents the whole painting as if you'd seen every brushstroke. Now hold this alongside something that takes it further. Researchers showed people photographs of faces for fractions of a second, so brief that the person had barely registered they'd seen anything, and asked them to rate the faces on traits like trustworthiness and competence. Not only did people produce consistent ratings from these fractional exposures, those ratings turned out to predict something far outside the lab, the outcomes of actual elections. The faces that were rated higher on competence in those split-second exposures went on to win their races at a rate that researchers found impossible to dismiss. Not because facial structure determines leadership ability, not because jaw shape predicts policy effectiveness, but because the ancient mechanism that reads faces, the one that was scanning for threat and alliance long before language existed, was doing its job. It was sorting, weighing, deciding, in fractions of a second. and the decisions it reached were shaping choices people believed were their own. Here is where it stops being just interesting and starts being genuinely uncomfortable, because we tend to assume that awareness protects us, that if we know something like this exists, we're somehow outside of it. We tell ourselves, I know about this tendency, therefore I'm accounting for it. But accounting for a mechanism and stepping outside of it are not the same operation. Knowing there's a current in the water doesn't mean you aren't being carried. It means you have a word for what's happening while it happens to you. The person who is most certain they are thinking clearly about someone, the careful analyst, the self-aware professional, the one who prides themselves on not jumping to conclusions, is often operating the furthest from where they believe they are. Not because they're fooling themselves deliberately, but because the mechanism that produces the impression and the mechanism that evaluates the impression are running in the same direction. One feels like intuition, the other feels like reasoning. Together they feel like confidence. If something in this video has made you stop and look at yourself differently, that recognition is exactly what this channel is built for. Follow along. There's more where this came from, and none of it is what you'd expect. Now step back further. Before you formed a conscious impression of the person across the table, before the spread of the halo, before the story was written, something else was already happening. Something your conscious mind doesn't have access to. Your brain was reading signals, not the content of what was said, not the ideas, not the logic, the other layer, the one that runs beneath language. How much physical space the person occupied, whether their energy was directed toward you or toward themselves. The rhythm of their speech, not the words, the rhythm. Whether eye contact was extended just long enough or broken just a beat too early. Whether the pauses felt like thinking or like retreating. These signals, invisible as individual events, are processed in aggregate by a part of the brain that evolved for a single purpose, determining whether another human being is safe to be near. That determination has nothing to do with intelligence. It has nothing to do with logic or training or years of learning to read people. It runs on hardware that's far older than any of those things. And it produces a verdict before the conversation has properly begun. Here is what makes this remarkable. Studies that measure these kinds of signals in group interactions, tracking things like energy, vocal patterns, turn-taking and attentiveness, can predict the outcomes of negotiations with high accuracy, using only data from the first few minutes of contact. Not the content of the negotiation, not the substance of the proposals, just the signals. Which means, by the time you think you're forming an impression, your brain has already run its deepest analysis. What comes after, the reasoning, the evaluation, the careful consideration, is, in a significant sense, interpretation laid over a verdict already reached. The mind doesn't experience it this way, of course. It experiences itself as looking, as weighing, as being genuinely open. But open to what? To new evidence that might revise the story, or to new evidence that confirms the story already written in those first moments of contact? This is the harder question, because the mind that's looking for confirmation and the mind that's genuinely revising can feel exactly identical from the inside. Both feel like thinking. Both feel like care. The difference only appears in the outcomes, in the shape of the questions you asked, the answers you let through, the moments where the story bent to the evidence, and the moments where the evidence bent to the story. And here's the contradiction that sits right at the center of this. The effort to become more rational about first impressions, the courses, the frameworks, the checklists, the deliberate pause before making a judgment, can create a new layer of confidence that rests on exactly the same foundation as the old one. You're no longer trusting a raw impression. You're trusting your improved process for managing impressions, which can feel more rigorous. And feel is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because if the mechanism runs before the process begins, if the story is already written before the checklist opens, then the checklist is annotating a conclusion, not reaching one. This is not a reason for despair, it's a reason for honesty. The kind of honesty that's harder to maintain than any framework. So here's the inversion. The problem isn't that you feel something strongly about a person in the first moments of meeting them. That's not weakness, that's not irrationality, that's architecture. The problem is the silence that follows, not the silence between words, the silence about the mechanism itself, the unchallenged assumption that the strength of the impression reflects the accuracy of the impression, that a vivid first read, a confident gut sense, a feeling of knowing, that any of these carry information about the person rather than information about the conditions of the encounter. Because an impression can be vivid and wrong in the same moment, coherent and incomplete, confident and unreliable. The vividness is a feature of the machine, not a signal of truth, and here is where it becomes collective, not just personal. Think about the decisions that are made in rooms full of careful people. Hiring decisions, funding decisions, decisions about who gets a second chance and who doesn't, decisions about who belongs and who remains on the outside of belonging. In those rooms, the individual impressions that arrived before the conversation began don't vanish. They accumulate, they combine, and then they get dressed in the language of deliberation, in words like fit and culture and instinct, and something I can't quite name, but I know it when I see it. What no one names is that the knowing happened in the first few seconds. Everything since then has been the group's way of arriving, together, at what each member already privately concluded. That is not conspiracy. That is not bad faith. That is a room full of humans doing what humans do, building the most coherent story possible from the signals available, and then mistaking coherence for truth. Sit with that for a moment, because the next time you walk into a room like that, whether as the person being read or the person doing the reading, the mechanism will run exactly as it always has, before you decide to use it, before you decide not to. The question that remains isn't whether the mechanism exists. The question is what you carry forward knowing it does. Not a fix, not a workaround, something quieter than that. A slight hesitation, maybe, before you trust the certainty. A pause before you call the finished story a portrait. A moment, just a moment, in where you leave room for what you haven't seen. Not because the impression was wrong. Sometimes it wasn't. But because you can't know which time is which until you've made space for the question. And most of us never do. If this kind of looking, at the things we think we see clearly, is the kind of thinking you want to keep doing, stay close, like this video, and leave something in the comments. A first impression you've had that turned out to be exactly right, or one that didn't. The real data is in the ones that didn't.